Good evening. Uh, the only thing that Denver asked me when I told him I was preaching is, how long is it going to be and how many jokes are you going to tell? So I think we're already starting out with high expectations. Um, I appreciate everyone coming tonight, everyone being here. I know it's, I still think of it as more of a privilege, I guess, to come out and be with everyone now since we got that taken away from us for a little bit. I know that kind of put a different perspective on it for me. And so I appreciate it more. And I think that that's one of the cool things about what we've gone through a little bit this year is it's made me appreciate some things that I didn't appreciate as much before. Um, so tonight I want to talk about fear. And I don't think we can talk about fear right now without talking about the obvious things, which are the pandemic and the election that have come up. There's a lot of fear associated with that from either side as far as the election goes, and from uh, just the I guess us as a society as far as coronavirus goes, right? And while those things are fearful or have made us fearful in the past, I kind of wasn't really thinking about that when I was looking at fear with myself. I know personally throughout this last year, um, at the beginning of the year, I was still in school, and I had an internship, but I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing with my life. Really, I didn't know what direction I was going to go. I didn't know where I was going to live. I didn't know, if I wanted to stay here, if I wanted to move anywhere else. I didn't really have anything pointing me in a direction, right? And I didn't know what I was going to do once I got there. And I found in that there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of me just really not knowing what the correct answer was. And I think probably everyone in this room can identify that. I'm sure that if you're older than me, that's happened more than just the times it's happened with me. And some people in this room have had a lot worse fear than just not knowing what state you're going to live in, right? So tonight, I just want to talk about fear. I want to talk about the examples of Elijah and Moses. Because I think when you think about the iconic figures in the Old Testament, there are a few that come to mind, Abraham, obviously, but Elijah and Moses are in the top. And I think to look at them and to realize that they had fears as well, that they were scared, and then realize how God helped them get through those situations, how maybe what they did, but also mostly what God did in order to direct them, is a really good way for us to understand how we should deal with our fear. So the first example, let's jump in. First example is the example of Elijah I want to talk about. And this is an example of someone who is afraid. If you want to turn to 1 Kings chapter 18 and 19, that's where we'll be. First example is someone who's afraid of external things, right? Things that are from the outside. Elijah here, um, Elijah destroyed the priest of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18. And I don't want to go ahead and read that because I think it would take too long. But I think we all know this story. This story was basically where Elijah set up a duel between him and the priest of Baal. And basically he said, I have my offering and you have your offering. And whichever one of us can call on our gods and have them bring fire down and consume these offerings, that's who the real God is, right? And they called on their gods for days and endlessly and cut themselves and all these things. And Elijah's standing over here and he's like, what, are they asleep? There nothing happens. Nothing, no fire came down from heaven. And Elijah, he doused his with water, right? He doused his sacrifice with water and then called on God, and God consumed that sacrifice in entirety with fire. And after that, Elijah goes and he destroys the priest of Baal. He kills all of them. And because of that, we see that Elijah was threatened by Jezebel. If we start in verse 1 of chapter 19, it says, Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, So may the gods do to me and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die and said, It is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Um, so we see here Elijah was threatened by Jezebel. Kind of good reason if you think about it from Jezebel's perspective. Obviously, she was a wicked woman, but he had just killed all of these priests. Um, so she was going to have recompense for that. She was going to have his blood in replacement for theirs. Um, and obviously, what does Elijah do? He flees. He flees from her. And like any of us, I think would, um, he he runs away from this impending doom. And he wanted to die. In verse 4, it says that he calls upon the Lord, which I think is an important point. He calls upon the Lord and he says, "Take me, Lord." Which I think, we can look at that and say that obviously he was scared of what Jezebel was going to do to him. It wasn't necessarily just that she was going to kill him, but she was going to cause him much pain, and that he would just rather die than have to endure what she would put him through if he fell into her hands. Um, so we see Elijah, he's in this state of fear. He's under this tree. And keep reading in verse 5. It says, he lay down and slept under a juniper tree. And behold, there was an angel touching him. And he said to him, arise, eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. So we see here that in this state of fear, in this state of basically hopelessness, the Lord provides for Elijah. And I think largely this is due to the fact that Elijah calls upon the Lord, right? He calls upon him, he says, Lord, he expresses that he is so scared right now, he'd rather die than have to endure this turmoil. And so God sends him this food, and then he brings him to Mount Horeb. And Mount Horeb, interestingly enough, is the same place that we'll be in our other example. So the Lord talked to Elijah on Mount Horeb. So if we read in verse 9, it says, then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken my covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So he said, go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind were rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? So we see here, the Lord talks to Elijah on Mount Horeb, and he asks him, what's wrong? And Elijah basically says, I've done everything you asked of me, Lord, right? I've been very zealous for the Lord. And the sons of Israel, your people, have they've torn down, they've forsaken the covenant, they've torn down your altars, they've killed your prophets, and I'm the only one left. You can see this broken spirit. And he explains that he's afraid of them coming to kill him. And then we see God's response. And God's response is in verse 11. He passes by. God passes by. And we see three things here that happen. There's a strong wind. The strong wind is so strong that it's breaking rocks off of the mountain, right? So, I mean, don't think about just your bedside fan that's blowing on your face like on high power 3. That's not it. That's not what that is. It's like a hurricane style wind, right? Strong wind. There's an earthquake and there's fire. But it says with each of these things, the Lord was not in those things. But in verse 12, God was not in these. But in verse 12, we see the gentle wind. A fire. Well, it says after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. And I think what's important here is, obviously God is proving to Elijah how powerful he is. But it's interesting that in him proving those things, it's not in the strong wind and the earthquake and the fire and the natural disasters that he brings that he's showing his power, but it's in the gentle wind that comes after that. And I think to me, this shows, God doesn't necessarily work in the way that Elijah would have expected him to. right? I think this is the point he's trying to prove is that Elijah, you leave it to me. I have control. I have power over all of nature, all of these things. You know, leave it to me because I know the way in which I'm going to make um, all of these things work together um, as my plan. So we see here Elijah. He has uh, he's been comforted by God in this looming external peril that he's in. And from there, I want to look at another example. I think the external example is a good one. I think that it's something we can apply, but I think that us personally, like, I don't remember the last time I've ever had someone chasing me trying to kill me. Um, and I hope that it's never the case, but obviously we can withstand that. But there's a fear of internal shortcomings that I see with Moses that I think is so applicable to me as far as how what I am normally insecure or afraid of. And we had Philip. Thank you for reading this. We read the beginning of this. This is Moses at the burning bush, and we see here in verse 6 the fear that Moses has. He says in verse 6, it says, he said also, I am the God of your, this is talking about God speaking, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So the first fear and kind of the baseline fear that we see here is a fear of God from Moses. And I think that we can understand that Elijah also had this fear of God, right? It's the thing that caused them to pause and to look and to be interested in these events that are happening. And I think that that is important when we're thinking about us having this baseline fear of God. That's what begins our understanding of what we need to do. But we really get into it, and we see that Moses here has four fears, and we'll go ahead and we'll read some of this to kind of put the context in the right place. And starting in verse 6, it says, starting in verse 7, it says, the Lord says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I've come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to the good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Verse 10, this is where he charges Moses with what he wants him to do. Therefore, come now, verse 10, and I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? So, starting here, we see that God has a big plan for Moses. Um, if we if we look at what he's asking him, he's asking him to go back to a land in which Moses, the reason really why he fled and left Egypt in the first place was because he killed a man that was attacking Israel. He's asking him to go back to that land. He's asking him to tell the leader of that country that he should let this massive labor force that he has go. And so I think if we look at that for what it is, I mean, understandably, Moses is scared. He's scared. He has a lot of reservations, and he has a lot of questions that he brings to the Lord. The first one that we see is in verse 11, and it's Moses' fear of his own inadequacy. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" I think we can relate with this, or I can relate with this. Oftentimes, whenever I'm even getting up to do something like this, where I'm presenting the Word of God, I think, who am I to deliver this message? Who am I? Because, well, what do I know? Preaching to people who have studied this Word, longer than I've been alive. Who am I to tell you of this? And that can kind of paralyze us, right? It can make us not want to fulfill what we know we should do. But what's interesting here is God's response. God's response is in verse 12. He says, and he said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain being Mount Horeb. So um, God's response is encouraging, right? It's encouraging to Moses here because he feels like he's all alone. He feels like God is asking him to do this solely based on his own power. And God's saying, no, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm going to be with you, but you have to make the decision to go and do this thing that I have asked you. So that's the first, the fear of his own inadequacy is Moses' first fear. Verse 13, continuing on, it says, Then Moses said to God, Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and now they may say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? So Moses' second fear here, fear of being able to prove that he has authority. Um, I think that ultimately this is something that um, without a lot of study and understanding, you may feel inadequate in this area too. Feeling like you don't have all the answers, that you don't know where to go to in the Bible to prove or to answer all the questions that may be thrown at you. I can tell you that ultimately, I've had studied over the last little while with some of my coworkers at work, and they ask me all kinds of questions that I don't understand or don't know what answers to give. But the one answer that I do know what to give is where my authority comes from, and that answer is in the scriptures, right? God's response is much like that. In verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent you. So God's response here is, well, you just tell them that their God sent you. And this really isn't a difficult answer, being that it is God that's speaking to you, right? But not only does he give him this response of the obvious, God the Father sent you, but he also gives Moses his complete plan. If we read that verse 15, starting verse 15. God furthermore said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. And go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite, Hittite, Amorite, and Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to you to what you say. And you, with the elders of Israel, will come to the king of Egypt and will say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. So here, God lays out his complete plan. It would have been enough. It should have been enough for Moses to go, just knowing that this is God, that God has sent him. But he's afraid of his own inadequacy. He's afraid that the people won't believe his authority, where the authority is coming from. And so God goes ahead and lays out the whole plan. He said, Look, Moses, you're going to go in here. You're going to go with the chief elders of the people. You're going to go to the leader of Egyptians. They're not going to let you go first thing. He lays this all out in the order that it's going to happen, so that the people can have a better understanding of what to expect. That's just impressive to me that God would allow us in on his plan, even though he doesn't have to. Next, in verse 1, Moses has his next fear. And Moses said in verse 1, What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, The Lord has not appeared to you. And continuing on, and the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? And he said, A staff. Then he said, Throw it to the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. But the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail. So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. And then the Lord also gives him two other uh, miracles to do. So Moses, his next issue is, what if they don't believe me? What if they say I'm a liar? And God says, I've got you covered, right? God's response, he gives him three signs to prove his authority. This one sign that we just read is that his staff is going to become a serpent and that he will be able to retrieve that and become a staff again. We know that um, he has this next where he puts his hand in his coat and then brings it out. And it's leprous, and then it's no longer leprous after he does it again. And then the last sign, which is the water turning into blood, which will be the first plague that will plague the Egyptians. So God doesn't just leave them out to dry. Doesn't just say, yeah, just make them believe you based on your word. He says, here's some signs that I'm going to give you in order for you to be able to tell these people that you're the real deal. And I'd say that we also have these signs, don't we? We're given these signs through what the apostles have written down for us in the scriptures. We see the signs of Jesus. We see him resurrecting people. We see him healing people. And we can show that to other people when they ask us what our authority is. And we can say, my authority is in the scriptures, and the scriptures tells me that Jesus has the authority, right? Moving on to the fourth and final fear that Moses has. He's kind of reached the end here, right? After God has given him all of these signs and miracles and things that he should proven, Moses says to the Lord in verse 10, then Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. The Lord said to him, who made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say. But he said, please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will. And the anger of the Lord burned against Moses, and he said, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently, and moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. So Moses' last ditch effort to get out of this is, I don't talk good. He basically says, I don't know how to convince people. I don't know how to say all these things that you've just told me in an eloquent way, that they'll believe me, that they'll understand me. And God gives him two responses. The first response is, I made you. I know what you can do. And I think that this is the one that we need to pay most attention to, because I think that this is more than likely true for us, right? Moses, could he really not speak? Could he really not say what God had told him to say? Well, we know he could because God said he could, right? But also we see him later on as the leader of this people. And I mean, that involves so much of this. So we know that he had it within him, and that God, he's made our mouths too. We can also do for him as he asked for Moses to do for him. Second response is anger, and then says, fine, Aaron can do it, right? And we kind of see that, I guess Moses presses so hard that he concedes. But we know that Moses goes on here to do the will of the Lord, even through all of this fear and apprehension that surrounds at the beginning. So moving on, let's talk about some consistent things between Moses and Elijah. We got Elijah, who's afraid of this external death or torment that was going to come on him from Jezebel, and Moses, who's afraid of this internal not measuring up to whatever God had brought to him. Both of them were overwhelmed. Both of them didn't know what to do when they were put in the position they were. And both had direct lines of communication to God, much as we do through prayer. Both chose to use that direct communication to God to express their fears to him, which I think is a big point here. We saw that Elijah, he expressed his fears to God under the tree. He said, I would rather die than go through this. And we have Moses, who expresses in conversation to the Lord through the burning bush all of these four fears that he is paralyzed by. But God provided for them both, right? He provided food for Elijah, and he provided reassurance for Moses. He also provided reassurance for Elijah on the mountain, showing him his power and his way. Um, both of them, they ended up making it through their fearful state. They were both paralyzed, right, by their fear. But through God's help and through their own actions and their willingness to turn to Him, they were able to go on to be great leaders in His kingdom. Moses, we know, led the Israelites out of Egypt and all the way to the edge of the Canaan land. He was able to do much more than he initially thought. And Elijah went on to anoint kings and establish his successor before eventually he was taken up in a chariot of fire by the Lord. So, and we know them now through the scriptures, how renowned they both were for their faith. So, what does this mean for me? As someone who's fearful of maybe my own inadequacies or the things that are swirling about in the world, like what does this mean for me? Well, I think the first thing is that fear can be present in my life, but it doesn't have to rule my life. It doesn't have to be the thing that causes me to either lock up or make decisions poorly, because we saw this in both Moses and Elijah. Moses, he was paralyzed by this fear, but he brought his concerns to God, and he pressed through those concerns after God answered every single one of them. And Elijah also voiced his concerns to God under the tree. So, when I'm afraid, when I don't know which way to turn in life, instead of just locking up, just have some faith and trust in God and express my fears and the things that are worrying me to Him, and allow those burdens to be put on Him. Next thing is fear can be calmed by God. And I say this as long as we are in a correct relationship with Him, as long as we are His people. God has promised us that everything's going to be okay. He's promised us that in the end, we will be with Him. No matter what happens to our physical body, no matter what we die of, no matter who persecutes us, we can be assured of the fact that eventually one day we're going to be with Him. And so that's very calming. But another aspect of it is fear can be magnified by God. Obviously, we saw that Moses was very afraid of God in his talking from the burning bush. But also us, we can have that fear of God if we are not in a correct, saved relationship with Him. Because knowing that we aren't going to be with Him, no matter what happens, should be one of the scariest things to us in this life. Fear, for us, I think for me, fear is almost always motivated by a lack of faith. I can tell you that when I've been most fearful in the past or most worrying about the most stuff, it's been because I haven't been putting my focus on the correct thing. It's because I haven't really been thinking about heavenly things, but instead I'm thinking about all the material things that are going on around me. Thinking about all of the sicknesses or the decisions that I have to make and putting all that pressure on myself rather than realizing that, ultimately, no matter what happens in this life, as long as I stay faithful to Him, I will end up in heaven with God. We can look to the Father like Elijah did in his time of distress. And lastly, fear can be a really helpful motivator for good. And I want to end on this point. Because I think that it's fear can kind of get a negative connotation, I guess. But the fact of the matter is, whenever I know when I obey the gospel, fear is just as much a part of that as knowing the truth of the gospel, because you know what you're missing out on if you don't obey the gospel. And so I hope that tonight, Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of God, the Lord, is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." I hope that that tonight has been helpful for us to go through and to look at some of the ways that we can rely on God, um, the ways that Elijah and Moses, great people of faith, relied on God. And I hope that if you're in a state where you're not in a saved relationship with the Lord, that you are fearful. I hope that you do understand that you're not in the correct relationship with the Lord and that something needs to change in order for you not to have that fear anymore of being separated from Him. So, if you have anything that you need to bring before us, if you need to be forgiven of your sins, or if you need to come and be baptized, please come forward and do that as we stand and as we sing.